queue for the bar is quite long, so if you'd like to get a drink first, make yourself comfortable, and put your feet up in Birmingham this afternoon, and we'll start in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for coming to this event this afternoon. My name is Simon Clark and I'm Director of FOREST, which, if you don't know, stands for Freedom Organisation for the Right to Enjoy Smoking Tobacco. And we were founded in 1979, so this is our 43rd year. We've been coming to the Conservative Conference for the best part of 15, 16 years, organising events like this or social events. But this afternoon, we're tackling the subject of should smoking be banned for good? And I'll introduce our speakers in a few minutes, but I just want to say a few words myself on the topic, and then I'll shut up after that, apart from asking the questions. But I want to address this whole issue of prohibition, especially in relation to tobacco. The threat of prohibition is nothing new because there has been clear evidence of creeping prohibition for decades. For example, public smoking bans are a form of prohibition because they severely restrict where people can smoke beyond what is reasonable. And in many countries, even designated smoking rooms and smoking booths are prohibited. Now, since banning smoking in all indoor public places, we've seen many examples of smoking bans being extended to outdoor public places and even social housing, prohibiting people from smoking in their own homes. Bans on menthol-flavoured cigarettes are an example of an entire category of cigarette being prohibited. In the UK, menthol cigarettes represented over 20% of the cigarette market, and now they're gone, prohibited. In America, there are plans to not only follow the EU lead and ban menthol cigarettes, but to limit nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels, effectively prohibiting cigarettes as consumers currently know them. Now, another example of creeping prohibition can be seen in New Zealand, where the government plans to ban the sale of tobacco to anyone born after 2008, while in the UK, a recent report commissioned by the government, the Khan Review, recommended that the government raise the age of sale of cigarettes by 1 year every year until no one is allowed to smoke. Now, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester and a former Labour Health Secretary, he supports a campaign that would make smoking history, while governments in England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland have all set targets by which they want those countries to be smoke-free. And by smoke-free, they mean fewer than 5% of the adult population smoking. In England and Wales, the target year is 2030, only 8 years away, and in Scotland, the target is 2034. Now, from a consumer perspective, the problem with these targets, they are difficult, if not impossible, to achieve without further and excessive regulation. And that often means prohibition and punitive taxation, which is a more subtle form of prohibition, effectively pricing consumers out of the market. It's not just politicians and public health campaigners who are targeting combustible tobacco. A couple of years ago, the tobacco company Philip Morris called on the UK government to ban the sale of cigarettes in England by 2030. This year in Scotland, the UK's leading vape retailer launched a campaign urging the Scottish government to ban smoking for good. And that's where we got the title of this event from. Now, we'll discuss alternative approaches to tobacco harm reduction later in this meeting, but it's worth pointing out that in many people's view, the smoking debate is not just about health, important though that is. It's also about two fundamental principles that are often overlooked by government, by public health campaigners, and even by many Conservative MPs, and those principles are freedom of choice and personal responsibility. So that's the background to today's discussion. Now let's introduce our panel, our esteemed panel. Now, if you were expecting to see Lord Moylan, I'm afraid Daniel can't be with us today, and he sent his apologies. We do have an excellent replacement, who I shall introduce in a moment. But first, let me introduce, on my left, Claire Fox, or Baroness Fox of Buckley, as she's now known. Claire is a writer, journalist, and politician who sits in the House of Lords as a non-affiliated life peer. She is the director and founder of the Academy of Ideas and is frequently invited to comment on issues relating to culture, education, media, and free speech on TV and radio. She was a panellist on BBC Radio 4's Moral Maze for over 20 years, and you may have seen her on Question Time just a couple of weeks ago on BBC One. To my immediate right, Chris Snowden is the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He is a regular contributor to The Spectator, Telegraph, and Spiked, and he is the author of a series of books. Titles include Polemics, Killjoys, Selfishness, Greed, and Capitalism, The Art of Suppression, The Spirit-Level Delusion, and Velvet Glove, Iron Fist, which is all about the history of smoking. He is also the editor of the Nanny State Index. And on my far right, which is, probably shouldn't use that expression around here, we have Mark Oates. Now, Mark is director of the consumer advocacy group, We Vape. He's a fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. Mark founded We Vape in 2020. An established harm reduction campaigner, he successfully quit cigarettes with the help of vaping and recognised the enormous potential it has to save lives. Now, Mark very kindly answered our SOS on Friday after Lord Moylan dropped out. Only 2 days ago, Mark was enjoying his honeymoon in a mountain villa on the Greek island of Santorini. Today he is speaking at a Forest Fringe event in Birmingham. So I think a round of applause to Mark and all our speakers. Right, thank you for applauding everybody who hasn't even said anything yet. So we're going to move straight to Claire first. Now, we're going to start with Claire because you are partly responsible for us having this debate, because earlier this year in the House of Lords, you challenged your fellow peers as follows. And you said, quote, "I would really appreciate a dose of honesty in this House. If those people who are so hostile to smoking a legal product believe it is the killer they allege, they should call for smoking to be made illegal and be done with it. It would be better and more heartfelt if they argued that tobacco should be illegal, then we would have a different debate." So, Claire, first question is, can you elaborate a bit on that, and in particular, what type of debate would that be, and why do you think they don't want to have it?
Thank you for inviting me. That's the first thing. It's horrible hearing your own words back at you. I was so frustrated, and I get continually frustrated in terms of legislation, when what is argued is effectively that we will make it impossible for you to do something that's legal, but we haven't got the courage to tell the public that we want to make it illegal. So I had to listen to a range of rather pompous, self-regarding speakers who basically suggested that smoking was far greater threat to this country than everything else. Tax cuts, nothing on it. War in Ukraine, nothing on it. Smoking was the devil incarnate, and all those ridiculous people who were stupid enough to carry on smoking had to be saved from themselves. And it was, what is the government going to do? What is the government going to do? And by the way, the government said, don't worry, we are going to do lots. We're going for a smoke-free society. And I simply thought, why don't you just say that you want to ban it? Right? Now, I obviously don't want smoking to be banned, because somebody actually tweeted afterwards, Claire Fox has called for the making of smoking to be illegal, which obviously was not my point. But I think that the relentless nature of the attacks on smokers and smoking is in some ways got nothing to do with smokers and smoking. It's a group of people who think that adults shouldn't be allowed to choose to live however they wish. And I do not need to be told that smoking is a rather dirty, unpleasant habit. I can't believe that I have to talk about it in the realm of politics. I'm allowed to have a dirty, unpleasant habit that I know, as you will tell from my voice, I've been doing for a very long time and has not enhanced my health prospects. My father died of lung cancer because he smoked so much. He died young. I'm not an idiot. I've worked it out. But that's the point. As adults, we can marry the wrong people. We can go out and get drunk. We can hang out with people that our parents would have disapproved of. We can wear outrageous clothes. We can do all sorts of things that somebody will tut at. But in a free society, that is one's choice. And I'm afraid that the health campaign around smoking set the precedent for an establishment elite to imagine that we couldn't make those decisions without their guidance and without their expert advice. And they demonise and try and delegitimise anyone who argues against them. And the final thing I'll say at this point is they always do it on the basis of protecting the poor and the vulnerable. Particularly in the House of Lords, it really is a bit like a kind of Victorian, help the poor society, where everybody talks about the poor all the time. Not working class people, not ordinary people, but the poor who need to be saved by these angels of mercy. And they posit it that way. And if it's not the poor, it's the children who we've got to protect, because they actually think that the poor and the working classes are like children who need to be looked after by the grown-ups. It's patrician, patronising, condescending, and an absolute enemy of freedom. So, as far as I'm concerned, why don't they have the courage to say, we want to ban it outright? I'll argue against them and win that argument. I can guarantee that, because actually the majority of people in this country do support freedom, even if they don't smoke and don't support smoking. That's my view.
Now, Claire, you mentioned your father. Do you want to tell us that anecdote that resulted in you changing your brand of cigarettes?
Yeah, this is slightly embarrassing, but my father, on his deathbed, called the family together and said, I've got an announcement. I want Claire to swear on my deathbed that she'll do this. And my mother and my sisters and the whole family was thinking, brilliant, he's going to say, stop smoking. He said, you're to promise me that you're never to smoke anything above silk-cut silver. I was Benton and Hedges. And to this day, I smoke silk-cut silver. This is not an advert, by the way. I think that he appreciated that I was never going to stop smoking, and that therefore he thought he'd go for at least a low-tar version of my my death. But anyway, so that's that. But I suppose one of the things to say about it was that I know that when I'm potentially dying of lung cancer, everyone will say, well, there you go, you shouldn't have done that, right? But this is my life. Not your life, it's my life. And whilst I am a free person, I will do things that none of you would approve of, probably. But that's the way we get along in a democratic free society. I don't need to be looked after. If I wanted to be looked after by those who know better, I'd move to China or some other authoritarian regime. But in free society, I'll choose to kill myself, even if it is on silk-cut light.
On that note, I think we'll move on. Right, Christopher. Now, you've written a lot about the temperance movement. Part of your book, Velvet Glove, was all about the temperance movement of the early 20th century. Now, did it ever actually go away? And does the modern public health industry, or how does the modern public health industry compare?
Oh, it's more or less one and the same thing, I would say. I mean, you don't really get much in the way of grassroots anti-smoking groups, of grassroots anti-drinking groups, really. I mean, actually, the old school temperance movement still has a bigger footprint, actually, in public health than a lot of people realise. But they don't need to be there because you have a public health movement. You have a public health movement lavishly funded by the government. And so the kind of people who 100 years ago would have joined the Anti-Cigarette League, which is a real thing in America, or would have joined the one of the Band of Hope or one of the various temperance groups, don't need to do that because they can look far more respectable by saying that they're public health specialists, public health advocates. But what they're calling for is very much the same kind of thing. It's supply side controls, banning advertising, raising taxes, reducing the availability of the product. And it's reducing the availability of the product is how we're going to see prohibition come about. Now, who would have thought 43 years ago, when Forest was formed, that we'd be one day having a debate about should cigarettes be prohibited, let alone one held by Forest itself. I'm not saying it's been a failing campaign, Simon, but I think actually some of the, it's clearly been an uphill battle for 40 years. I think actually some of the people involved in Forest's early days got involved precisely because they did think we would get to this point. And their opponents in the anti-smoking lobby consistently and explicitly denied it. And it was seen as a straw man, perhaps still is to some of you seen as a straw man, that we're going to have some kind of prohibitionist element to this. But if you look at Javed Khan's recent review, he was asked to come up with some policies. Apparently politicians can't come up with policies anymore. They need to outsource them to some random member of the blob. And he was asked to come up with some policies, how to get to below 5% smoking prevalence by 2030. He had a look at this, by which I mean he had a word with various anti-smoking groups and public health fanatics, and he said, actually, that's not a sufficient target. This was Theresa May's target, her legacy, just like Boris Johnson's net zero legacy. There seems to be a thing these days that you just have a legacy by setting a date for something long after you're going to be in power and leave it up to other people to work out how to do it. And he said, well, this is not sufficient. It shouldn't be 5% in 2030. It should be 0% in 2040. And all my recommendations are based on that target. One of them was, Simon's already mentioned it in the context of New Zealand, raising the age at which you can buy tobacco every year until you get to the point, theoretically at least, where you have 100-year-old people being asked to buy cigarettes for 101-year-old people. This is something that is, I understand from people in New Zealand that this is a very serious proposal and is being legislated upon, along with the other neo-prohibitionist idea, which is just to simply take the nicotine out of cigarettes or to reduce the amount of nicotine in cigarettes to a supposedly non-addictive quantity, whatever that means. Either way, you have prohibition. With the age thing, it takes years to do, but I think in practice what happens is you get about 7 years into this, and people start saying, well, this is silly because 26-year-olds can buy cigarettes and 25-year-olds can't. Let's just stop everyone buying cigarettes, right? And the reducing nicotine idea is this crazy idea that keeps popping its head up every now and again. Nothing ever happens because people realize that this is like the opposite of harm reduction. That e-cigarettes get rid of the stuff that harms you and leaves the nicotine in, which is why people smoke. This idea gets rid of the nicotine, which is basically harmless and the reason why people smoke, and keeps all the stuff in that kills you. It's a stupid idea, but I gather, again, from in New Zealand, that they're genuinely going to do this. So we might have a real-world experiment on this side of it. But the interesting thing is, in both cases, they're not calling it prohibition. Prohibition still has a sufficiently dirty name that people will use all other sorts of euphemisms, the tobacco-free generation, the end game. One academic who wants to ban cigarettes calls it abolition, because that sounds more like abolishing slavery, and we're kind of in favor of that, so we use it. They won't use the word prohibition, but make no mistake, that is exactly what it is, and that can be opposed in two ways. Firstly, through basically philosophical appeals to freedom, and obviously I agree with her ladyship about everything she said there, but also just on simple pragmatic grounds that prohibition does not work. It creates all kinds of problems. We already have a significant black market in tobacco in this country. If you look to Australia, where they've tried every anti-smoking policy in the book, and they've banned e-cigarettes, and they have the highest tobacco duty in the world, their customs people intercepted over 1 billion cigarettes last year. They intercepted over 900 tons of hand-rolling tobacco. That's just what they got hold of. And you can be sure that's only a fraction of what's getting through to a relatively small country with a relatively low smoking rate. So, God forbid anybody should be foolish enough to pick on one of these, act upon one of these prohibitionist ideas. I suspect somewhere like Australia or New Zealand possibly will. I'm sure we will see the same damage again. And ultimately, we just need to settle ourselves down here and say, is it true that only 5% of the population want to smoke? Is it true that there's nobody in the population wants to smoke? Because if smokers aren't asking for help from the government, and most of them aren't, You know, people say, oh, 90% of smokers want to quit. You look at the surveys, it's about 50%, and they're only the ones who say in it. They don't actually do it, otherwise they wouldn't be smokers. But even if you accept that, you know, smoking is hard to give up, which of course it is, just the ones who even say they want to give up in a survey, when there's a lot of social desirability bias, it's only 50%. The smoking rate in this country is about 13%. So the number of people who want to continue smoking despite everything is well above 5%, and therefore there makes no sense to even have a target on this.
I think it's also worth making the point that, yes, people might say they want to quit smoking, but that doesn't mean to say they want the government to force them to quit smoking. I'm not a smoker, but the analogy I always use is that I'm overweight, I know I ought to lose weight, and I should lose weight, but I don't want the government banning donuts and cream cakes in order to force me to lose weight, or restricting how big a portion of food I can eat. That's the difference. Now, Chris, you didn't mention South Africa there, did you?
You didn't ask me about it.
No, I'm going to ask you about it now. Now, while we're talking about prohibition, there has recently been a test case, if you like, because during COVID, the South African government actually banned the sale of cigarettes. Now, Chris knows more about it than I do. So that was a test case. What was the impact and what was the outcome?
There's been 3 countries in the modern era that banned cigarettes. One of them is not really a country, the Islamic State of Syria and Levant, and that didn't last so long. There was Bhutan, which banned tobacco in 2004, and funnily enough, repealed the ban during COVID, because there were so many smugglers coming over the border spreading COVID, they decided it was, for public health reasons, it would be better to let people smoke. The other is South Africa. In fact, South Africa wasn't alone in banning tobacco. A number of countries did, alongside alcohol. So when the lockdowns came in, a few governments decided this is a good opportunity here to start experimenting on some stuff that we'd really been quite liking to do for some time. So at one point during COVID, I think 1 in 5 people around the world could not legally buy tobacco. Slightly larger proportion couldn't buy e-cigarettes, and 1 in 4 people lived in a country where you couldn't buy alcohol. India had a total ban on both. South Africa, as you say, had a ban on both. It didn't work. I'll read simply from a study. I don't think the outcomes will be particularly surprising to you, but an academic study did look at the impact of the tobacco sales ban, and it found, I quote, most smokers continued smoking despite the sales ban. During the ban, prices increased by over 240%. Purchases shifted away from the normally dominant brands of the multinational tobacco companies to local and regional producers. Cigarette sales continued despite the sales ban, further entrenching an already large illicit market.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to come back a bit later to the economics of smoking, because there's quite a good debate to have around that. But I want to bring Mark in. Mark, you're a vaping advocate. Now, I think there might be quite a few people here today who've read reports, scare stories about vaping in the media. So can you briefly make the case for switching to vaping from smoking?
Well, all the evidence is quite clear that it's vastly safer than smoking. Public Health England tell us it's 95% safer than smoking. I should add, just so people know my position, I think people should be free to smoke if they so choose. But the point is that the government is actually doing a bad job of letting people know that vaping is vastly safer than smoking. Recent polling suggested 60% of the smokers either don't know whether vaping is safer or they think it's actually more dangerous than smoking. That translates to about 1.5 million smokers that would actually be vaping if they knew the real relative risk. Ultimately, people are going to use nicotine. People smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. And so, as Christopher has kindly pointed out, 50% of smokers don't want to quit. So the only way you can get them to quit is if they can continue to doing something they enjoy, but without the harm. And that's why, quite rightly, Christopher's right to point out that the target is a bit silly. I think there's a big difference between aspiration, which I support an aspiration to make the British public healthier. A target, though, in my mind, a target is for something along the lines of we want to have 90% of people to have their hip operation within 3 months of being referred. It's different in the sense to do that, you need maybe more funding, perhaps not. You need a more efficient healthcare service. Good luck with NHS on that one. And you need people to work harder. But with smoking, you're talking about people's choices. And what I fear is the government aren't going to take a positive approach to reducing the smoking rate. They're going to get close to 2030, and they're going to end up going for punitive measures. And there's 2 problems with that. Firstly, I think it's wrong on a freedom basis, but just as importantly, it won't actually work. as we've seen in South Africa, an outright ban led people to continue to smoke. And I know that if I was in the cohort of people that was not allowed to buy cigarettes, and my year above were allowed to buy cigarettes, the first thing I'd be doing would be buying cigarettes. And if I was in the cohort of the year above that I could still buy them, I'd probably be selling them to make loads of money. What you're doing is, I don't understand these public health experts. They're looking at the drugs market and going, yes, that's exactly what we want. We want a new criminal market for a mild stimulant that kills you in the long term, 50% of users. And we'd like that. We'd like more drug dealers. We'd like more people in poverty having to scrimp and save to pay more money for vastly more expensive cigarettes. It seems like madness.
Okay. Now, you also founded the Snus Users Association, if I've pronounced Snus right. Again, can you tell people a little bit about Snus? Because that's actually prohibited in this country. It's prohibited throughout the EU, apart from Sweden, where it originated, I think. So can you explain a little bit about it and why you'd like to see that legalised?
So snus is actually the reason why I quit smoking. I quit smoking through a combination of snus and nicotine pouches. But when I came back from Sweden, I couldn't get hold of it back in 2014. So I was flipping between smoking and using Swedish snus when I could illegally, well, I wasn't breaking the
Tell
law.
them what Swedish snus is.
Sorry, Swedish snus, if anyone doesn't know, it's a bit like this. I've actually got a nicotine pouch with me. But
Same principle.
same principle, but it's tobacco rather than nicotine consummate, and it goes in your top lip. And it's the reason why Sweden has the lowest smoking rate related illnesses in Europe. It's got and the lowest smoking rate in Sweden for men. So it's a direct correlation, and all the data is quite clear there. They've reduced the smoking rate not by forcing people to quit smoking, but switching them onto something that's vastly safer. It was banned in the 1990s by Edwina Curry. Thank you very much. She was scared that young people were going to start using Swedish snus, and those same arguments are being echoed today. People fearing that young people are going to take up vaping, even though it's vastly safer. Edwina Curry, in my mind, is known for screwing over three groups of people. The chicken farmers with the salmonella scare, the snus users like me, and of course, John Major. So we should legalise it, and I just want to point, Javed Khan's report on smoking, he said that we don't need to legalise snus because there's nicotine pouches, which, just to clarify, are perfectly legal. But I think if there's just one person in this country that improves their health and saves their lives by switching from smoking to Swedish snus because it's legalised, it would be worth it. And in order to achieve that, in order to achieve what they call smoke-free, you need as many options to the public as possible. It's not a one-trick pony. I'm a big supporter of vaping, but vaping in itself doesn't work for everyone. You've got heat not burn, which the public don't know about because they're not allowed to know about it because of the advertising laws, because it contains tobacco. You've got nicotine pouches, which is a new product for many people, and then of course Swedish snus. So you need all these choices, and I know that a lot of people here believe in free choice, so that's how we should go about doing it.
Okay, well, I'm glad you've mentioned the Khan report again, because I want to come back to that and ask Chris something about it. Now, give you an idea of some of the, well, actually, Chris, you've referred to some of the ideas and recommendations in the Khan review as crackpot. And I wondered which in particular, which crackpot ideas did you have in mind?
Well, raising the age of purchase every year till people can't even work out how old you have to be is pretty crackpot. Painting cigarettes green or brown is pretty crackpot, I would say. Presumably because he thinks that these are the least attractive colours. I mean, a cigarette painted brown just looks like a mini cigar. And presumably if the tobacco industry thought that was an unattractive design, they would have painted it a different colour long ago. What else is in there? God, I can't remember. Not being able to show people using tobacco on TV until 9
Yeah, well, I can read out a list. Marking each cigarette with the specific number of minutes of life lost. Banning films that show smokers before the 9 p.m. watershed. Giving all new films with smoking scenes an 18 rating. Banning people who live in social housing from smoking in their own home. Banning smoking in beer gardens and other public places such as beaches, and increasing the price of a pack of cigarettes by 30% overnight. I mean, this is where we're going, and I say people perhaps don't think that's prohibition. But clearly, we are edging towards prohibition, which is why, we need to make much more of a stand in it.
They're the kind of policies you get when you still, as Claire says, still don't have the bottle to say we want prohibition, but we're just going to try and think of some regulation, having used every trick in the book. They were scraping the barrel with the plain packaging policy, which has since been shown to have made no difference whatsoever, despite them going on about it for years. Huge amount of money spent, public money spent campaigning for plain packaging. It doesn't make any difference, which is why most countries haven't followed suit. You had the display ban, you had the graphic warnings, all this stuff. And this is the sort of reductio ad absurdum element to it, when you just go, well, let's put individual warnings on each cigarette, and then people will realise that smoking's not good for them. It's absurd. But let me say one thing about the Khan report, which is the title of it is Making Smoking Obsolete. And I don't think he understands what the nature of obsolescence is. Now, it may well be that, apart from a few, diehard smokers like Claire, well, I don't know if diehard's the right word, but a few smokers like Claire will always want to smoke. There'll be people who always want to smoke a cigar, I expect. But in the main, it's quite plausible that cigarette smoking could become virtually obsolete within the next 20 years or so, from people switching to other nicotine products. But things become obsolete because better things come along. DVDs became obsolete because of streaming. Videos became obsolete because of DVDs, and so on. They don't become obsolete because the government just brings in lots of stupid regulations to deter people from using them. So if we are going to see cigarette smoking virtually obsolete, it will happen by encouraging people to use alternative, safer forms of nicotine. And Khan basically ignores that aspect of it in his review. Instead, just scrapes the barrel with, how else can we bang smokers over the head,
Right. Claire, you want to come in?
Well, I wanted to note that social housing point, because actually this has been lurking around this debate for some time, and quite a lot of councils from left to right are seriously discussing this. And I mean, you couldn't make it up. If ever there was an elitist outlook, it's to take people who are dependent in some way on the state because their housing is provided by the state, and then to deprive them of equal rights, and to tell them that their private sphere is no longer private. And we saw, even in relation to the lockdown, that councils were telling people that they had to work from home, but they therefore couldn't smoke at home because they were at work. I mean, what? But that's what they were saying. And also, health visitors, or say, if you're being visited, if you're an older person who's being visited by somebody in the health service, you're not meant to smoke for 2 hours before they come because it will affect the safety and so on. So you can see that the autonomy of individual people is being chipped away at. And I suppose what I've always tried to say is, I don't really care about smoking. I mean, I know that I would probably do quite a lot of damage if somebody tried to stop me smoking, but that's in a way a personal point. But my point as the director of the Academy of Ideas is, this is an attack on autonomy, on the autonomous rights of individuals in a free society. Chris is absolutely right. All of these pragmatic things are true. But when you think about what happened with the smoking issue, it's been used as a blueprint for lots of other things. So the reason why then we have to, it doesn't matter whether you're a smoker or not, why the issues around people's agency and autonomy matter, that their private sphere of the home, walking in public as a private individual, should not be interfered in by the state, is because it's used beyond smoking. Just the only other thing is, there is an element of this which is effective though. When everything makes it impossible to smoke, it gets tricky. I'm absolutely horrified by what they've done in relation to hospitals. I think it's completely inhumane, and mental health facilities. But hospitals, you've just found out that your mother's dying, and you go out for a cigarette and the cops are at your door, that kind of thing. Or you're in hospital and you know you're dying and you just want a cigarette and you're about to go and have chemo. You should be allowed to have that cigarette without people pouncing on you. If they make it so inconvenient to smoke, then of course it will to a certain extent, erode some people's smoking. But it will turn it into an illicit activity. And one thing about illicit activities is it gives it a certain glamour, right? So if you want to encourage young people to smoke, you turn it into a thing which actually only the naughty people do behind the bike shed, right? So ironically, I think that although it's inconvenient to smoke now, they have also, and they've done this with vaping, they've turned it into something which those people who've got a bit of spirit think, well, I'm not a rule, I don't follow the rules. I might take it up because it gives me a bit of an edge. So I think the whole thing is it won't work at the levels that Chris and has been explained. But I also think that we have to fight it philosophically as well as just pragmatically. Because I think that freedom is on the line, even on smoking, even though it's very unfashionable to defend smokers.
And funnily enough, that's exactly what has happened with vaping in America, where they have this huge panic about underage vaping. And actually, they do have a large number of underage vapors over there. But largely because it's been stigmatized so much by there's been such hysteria about it from grown-ups that the young people think this is something that's probably pretty cool. Australia, as I said before, total ban on e-cigarettes. Can't even import them for your own use now. And yet the newspapers in Australia are filled with this reefer madness thing of all these kids vaping. And I think the underage vaping rate is higher in Australia, where it's totally banned, than it is here in Britain, where health agencies actively encourage people to vape, or certainly smokers to vape. So you do see this effect, because in England with vaping, it's just middle-aged people like me with unsexy devices like this, and it's just a kind of way to stop smoking. But in Australia and America, because they've had this frenzy about youth smoking, young people have gone, well, this sounds interesting. I'll have a go.
Okay, now actually, from what Claire was saying, links us quite nicely to talking about the issue of health disparities and levelling up, which are sort of buzzwords these days. And the anti-smoking lobby is often arguing that improving people's health in poorer communities is an important part of the levelling up process. It's all part of improving health disparities, which is why they would argue the government must intervene and help people to quit smoking. Now, I would actually argue that many people smoke for comfort. They might be suffering from depression because they live in a poor environment, an unpleasant environment. So I personally think the government, rather than trying to force people to quit smoking, should try and improve the environment in which many people actually live. But I wondered what the rest of the panel thought about that.
I've got to just say, and this comes back to what Javed Khan was talking about, the tax. It becomes incredibly counterproductive on a practical basis. Part of the reason why we do have a high vaping rate in this country is the big price differential between vaping and smoking. And when you increase, like he was talking about 30% increase in tax, you just push people to the back market. And frankly, a lot of these people, bureaucrats, they don't realise that actually a lot of people are buying their cigarettes on the black market. I worked in a shop and the windows cleaner would come around and sell cigarettes, So you're not helping, the Treasury doesn't take any more money in, and you're actually pushing people into cheaper cigarettes, often from Europe, and that hinders the rise of vaping. And ultimately, as you say, the more tax you put on it, the more you are hurting the poor. And it's frankly madness. And it's been mentioned about sort of being punitive and the bullying against smokers, but it strikes me as we're in a similar position as we were in the 1980s with HIV. Putting people dying of cancer that have smoked on cigarette packets, they used to put pictures out of people dying with HIV, and it was this pernicious, patronising, it's your fault, you deserve to die, rather than, and what we've learned from HIV is, we need to help people. We know people are going to have sex. How do we make sure they do it in a safe way? We've now got PrEP, a drug which has reduced the transmission of HIV by 50% in at-risk communities. And right now we have the same thing when it comes to reduced-risk nicotine products, but we're not embracing it. We're not here, but a lot of public health are still thinking about bullying, still have this patronising belief that all we need to do is tell smokers that it's dangerous. But we all know when we smoked that it was dangerous. That's not the issue. We enjoy using nicotine.
The whole issue of health inequalities for years has been used as a cover for imposing the lifestyles of the upper middle class onto ordinary and working class and low-income people. And that has been since followed through by we're levelling up, a pretty fatuous slogan, which public health people immediately leapt on and said, levelling up, this means we need to get poor people to change their diets and stop drinking so much and stop smoking, stop gambling. And there is a point very often goes ignored, and perhaps people don't want to hear it very often. But it's something that George Orwell actually touched upon in The Road to Wigan Pier when he was trying to work out why is it that all these people I'm staying with in the northwest of England, coal miners, why do they have such bad diets? They don't need to, and the diets aren't even necessarily cheaper than having a good diet. And he made the fairly obvious point that if your life is pretty miserable, then if you can make it a little bit better by having lots of jam on your toast and 4 sugars in your tea, then you will do it because you put less value on tomorrow. You put less value on future years. Exactly the same thing applies to smoking, where as cigarette duty has gone up and up and up and up, the difference between how many people at the top of the income distribution and bottom, it goes in exactly the opposite way that you would expect. You would expect poor people to be most responsive to tax increases. And the same is true also of gambling, that people have it's their own personal circumstances that lead people to engage in risky behavior. And it's not irrational for them to do so. During COVID, you saw this, again, even in Britain, you saw this weird natural experiment by which suddenly the number of places where you could buy booze fell by 2/3 because restaurants, hotels, clubs and everything were closed. Alcohol advertising collapsed like most alcohol advertising does, and actually per capita consumption of alcohol dropped somewhat. Now, according to public health dogma, that should have led to a big, or at least a commensurate decline in the number of alcohol-related deaths. Instead, we had the biggest spike in alcohol-related deaths, about 20% increase in alcohol-related deaths on record. Why is that? Well, clearly it's got nothing to do with taxation. It's got nothing to do with availability. It's got nothing to do with advertising. It hasn't even got anything to do with general per capita consumption. It's some people in pretty horrible, tedious, boring, nervous circumstances were effectively self-medicating with alcohol. And that, I think, you can expand on that more broadly, that it fairly obviously is about people's circumstances. I don't have the answer, nor does anybody else, how you can make everyone's circumstances better, but you're not actually helping people who are in bad circumstances by taking away the things that are making their life a little bit better every day.
I mean, surely the problem about for poor people is that they're poor. This idea that poor people lives can be improved by making them smoke less. I mean, poverty's grim, right? It's bloody grim. And if the energy that was put into stopping poor people eating the wrong food and smoking was put into actually building a productive economy that might mean that people were less poor, we might get somewhere. I mean, never mind tax cuts, that might actually have a bit of an impact, right? I think that, though, we have to see it, and I think Chris is really onto something, the way he explained that why it is that in those circumstances you might not always make the right choices, or as they would see it, the right choices. When you think about the climate of safetyism and risk aversion we saw during lockdown in relation to old people in care homes, which was, we're going to save you from COVID by making your life hell, depriving you of seeing anybody that you love or care for, locking you in your room, and basically turning your quality of life into not being worth living. But it's all right because we're doing it to keep you alive and for your safety. And this is an approach to risk aversion and public health safetyism that I think we have seen in relation to smoking the poor. Your life's hell. We're going to improve it by removing something we've decided makes it worse, but actually is going to make it even more hellish.
Right, I'm going to shut you up now because you actually want to bring in the audience, don't you?
I do.
Now, Claire has already been tweeting
Is the
earlier.
implication that you don't?
Well, no, I'm very keen to hear from the audience because that's really the whole point about an event like this. And Claire was tweeting earlier today. What's the expression you used about some of the other events you've been to?
A bit sterile.
Right, so ladies and gentlemen, we have 15 minutes to make this event less sterile and get as many comments in as possible. Right, we'll start with the gentleman at the front and we'll get around you as quickly as possible.
Ryan Hoey, South Belfast Association. The smokers are big net contributors to the Exchequer, because they obviously pay a lot of tax on cigarettes and also generally die earlier, so that's less on pensions and less on health and on healthcare in the long run. If we're going to reduce the deficit, and there's been a lot of talk about how we're going to pay for all these tax cuts, should we not be setting a target to increase the smoking rate to bring down the deficit?
I think, Chris, that's one for you. You're the economist.
I don't know if that would be very popular. I think you have to work within the realms of the possible in politics. I mean, you're obviously right about the economic arguments, and the by far the most popular argument you will hear from people, whether it's face-to-face or in the comments below the Daily Mail or what have you, is, I don't mind if people want to smoke or eat themselves to death or drink themselves to death, but why should I have to pick up the pieces? I've got to pay for their NHS care. And as you've already alluded to, all the economic evidence, particularly on obesity and smoking above all, actually, shows it's the exact opposite of that. The aging population is the thing that's going to bring down the NHS, if anything does. But no, I mean, we shouldn't be actively encouraging unhealthy lifestyles in order to save money. But it would be nice if people stop using fallacious economic arguments to justify paternalism.
It would, just to point out, it would be very helpful for the poorest in Britain if they were to make that switch from from smoking to vaping. You're talking about sort of 30% increase in disposable income if they make that switch, and that's very targeted. And that money just obviously doesn't go away; they end up spending on things, so that has an advantage as well.
Actually, no, I don't want to interrupt. No, next person, gentleman here.
Hi, Paul Darhill. My 12-year-old daughter was telling me one of her friends had bought a vaping thing illegally from a newsagent locally, and I was horrified, right? And she didn't try it. If it's safe, right? I'm understanding the arguments and I've read through it. Should I have just said, "Oh, it's great, you should have tried it," or was I right to think you should, resist?
I think age of 12 probably is a bit young. Mark?
Yeah, well, it's still illegal, and I wouldn't encourage anyone to break the law. And trading standards need to do a vastly better job to crack down on people that are illegally selling. But it's the same issue we have with young people getting hold of alcohol, and it should be treated the same way. So I think you're right to take it off them. Having said that, harm reduction isn't just for adults. If you have a 15-year-old, 16-year-old child and they're smoking, then it would be better if they were vaping. But ultimately, they shouldn't be doing anything. There is an argument brewing, which is, is vaping just for people to quit smoking? And I'd say the best analogy is electric cars. We don't tell people that you can only drive an electric car if you first damage the planet with a combustion engine vehicle. So ultimately, if you're a 20-year-old and you're thinking you want to use nicotine, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, nicotine itself is fairly safe, then you're vastly better choosing a safer form of doing so. But frankly, if my daughter or son came home with a vape, I wouldn't be calling the local newspaper to tell them, as some people do. And it's quite odd. I call it sort of new technology bias. If you called your local newspaper and said, I found a bottle of beer in my son's bedroom, they wouldn't print the story. But tell them that, you found a vape and it'll be all over the news.
There is, I think, probably a moral panic on its way. It's already beginning to grow about probably Elf Bar. I wouldn't be surprised your daughter brought back, or maybe a Geek Bar. These disposable, brightly coloured disposable e-cigarettes are becoming popular with school kids. There's no two ways about it. And I think we're going to see a similar moral panic to what we saw in America with Juul, where Juul became unbelievably popular. Both relatively similar devices insofar as they're quite small. You can pop them into your pocket. But we also, Mark is quite right, that this is an enforcement issue. It's far too easy to buy these things online and also in shops, and we do need to be enforcing the law. The law is exactly the same as it is with cigarettes, and it's really hard for kids to buy cigarettes these days. But we do need to also have this discussion about whether vaping has some kind of prophylactic effect. As youth smoking declines more and more, and there's so few kids now smoking, nobody was particularly surprised or shocked a few years ago, even 5 years ago, if you told them that 5 or 6% of kids take up smoking. You go, well, we'd expect that. Obviously, kids are always going to take up smoking. But then if it drops down to kind of 1%, but 4% of vaping, do you then have a big panic about vaping? Well, a Scottish MEP tweeted the other day that she was distraught having gone to a meeting with one of these anti-smoking groups and found out that kids are vaping instead of smoking. Now, it's probably a badly worded tweet, right? It sounds like, she'd rather have them smoke. But that genuinely is actually the choice to a large extent. I personally would rather, I've got an 11-year-old daughter, I don't want her doing anything like that yet, but, you know, when she gets older, I would much rather she vapes than smokes. And if she does vape, the chances of her then progressing to smoking, the evidence does show that very, very unlikely that would happen. And why would it? Why would you switch to something that's 100 times more dangerous and 10 times more expensive? So of all the things that teenagers could be doing, I would say vaping is pretty low on the list. And we certainly shouldn't be wrecking the vaping market for adults in an attempt to stop kids doing it. But we should certainly enforce the existing laws.
Okay, next, I will come to you next, and the gentleman over here first. I'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you. My name is Paul Benstead, and I'm Altrincham in Sale West. Just very quickly, first of all, Chris, the northwest of England is fabulous. So you said it's very bleak up in the northwest. There are some very nice places up there.
Norway.
No, absolutely. But just in terms of Claire's point about liberty, I do appreciate her comments. I do agree with that. Clearly, over the last couple of years, you know, the state did come down rather heavily on the unvaccinated as well, sort of similar sort of thing. I have no issues with smokers smoking when it's for themselves. I do struggle, though, when you see pregnant women at maternity hospitals or smoking in a car with children in the back of the car, you know, with the windows all shut. That's the only time I struggle with the idea of just letting everyone smoke and do whatever they want. It's just where it potentially impacts, you know, the children's lives, and particularly a sort of young baby as well.
On that, there's a really interesting study planned with the NHS to pay pregnant women who can't quit smoking to take up vaping, because the evidence suggests there's no harm to the fetus if they vape. So again, the answer, clearly if you're a mother and you're not quitting smoking, it shows how difficult it is, and just bullying them some more isn't going to work. So offering them that opportunity to get out of it in a safe way but still doing what they enjoy is the answer.
I do think we have to be careful, though, because we can disapprove of people's parenting skills, whether you like it or not, right? I mean, I don't really care whether you disapprove. I mean, you know, so what? But I think this is quite important, because I tell you what, women haven't fought for equality to have people wandering around disapprove. You can disapprove, and then it can go away, right? I mean, because it might not be smoking the next time. You know, I saw a woman in a car doing this, playing this kind of music with children in the back. Banner. I mean, we're in a society where those kind of things become acceptable. And if you look at the panic around pregnant women having a glass of wine, the absolute nonsense, non-evidence that's been used to demonise that, you know, let women, trust women to know what they're doing as they go through their pregnancies. Thank you very much.
Okay, gentleman here, and then guy in the light blue shirt afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm George Carroll. I'm a councillor in the Vale of Glamorgan. In Wales, the Welsh Government have recently banned smoking on hospital premises. And in my council ward, there is a very large hospital. And the effect of that policy has been that, whereas before you would have designated smoking areas within that hospital, now you get groups of probably between 30 and 40 people congregating in residential areas smoking, because that's the only place that they can do it. And quite frankly, within my community, that's gone down like a cup of cold sick. So I just really wanted to say that it endorses the points that the panel made about you may try and influence people's behaviour to stop them from doing something, but in reality, all you're going to do is push them into doing something else to get around it, and with that being a case in point, often causes more problems for other people.
Totally self-inflicted and avoidable problem. Used to have a smoking shed around the back of the hospital. People went to it, there was no problem. Then they decided, for basically ideological reasons, that it is wrong to facilitate in any way smoking on NHS grounds, so everyone started puffing away outside, and people quite rightly complained that they had to go through a cloud of smoke, so then they moved it further and further down, so you eventually get to the hospital gates, and then people complain that there's a whole lot of people at the hospital. You know, just let people smoke in a shed. Why are you taking these things down? It's crazy.
I mean, just because I'm from Wales, that's why I mentioned the hospital thing. But I didn't explain it very well. But, you know, I know people who kind of like are wheeling people on trolleys miles to get outside onto the road. And then they're being told that they're being irresponsible with the patient. This is their family taking them out. And there's the patient saying, take me out for a cigarette. And it used to be simple, and it caused no harm to anyone. And it's mean-spirited, isn't it? It's inhumane. That's what I can't stand. They posit themselves as the nice people. these people are, misanthropic and nihilistic about the way people live. And people are going through an awful lot of problems when they're in hospital, and therefore you should let them have that very minor little pleasure, which is a bloody smoking shelter in the freezing cold. It's hardly a luxury.
Right, gentleman in the pale blue shirt. And then I do want to get somebody a bit further back.
Hi, Rick Moore from Blackburn Association. Just wondering how much you think sort of the criticisms of smokers and the push to try and ban smoking feeds into a wider authoritarianism that we're seeing around public health, whether that be mandatory vaccinations or sugar taxes and so on, and whether you think that it's part of a wider drive in that respect.
You want to take that? Chris?
Is it part of a wider drive to control our lifestyles? Well, of course it is. Of course it is. This is part of the reason I call my book Velvet Glove, Iron Fist. It's a slippery slope idea. It's a thin end of the wedge. It's, I think, inarguable now, isn't it? That these people they're all inspiring each other. They're all learning off each other. We hear about this and that being the new tobacco. Sugar's the new tobacco. It's all the same. People, apart from anything else, very often, but it's the same agenda. It's like, well, this worked with tobacco. Often it didn't even work with tobacco, but smoking rates have been going down pretty much, constantly, regardless of policy. And the people who are obsessed with sugar consumption, obesity, gambling, even now is being portrayed as a public health issue. I mean, how tenuous is that? And they want to use the same things. That's ban. They're such blunt tools. There's so little thought goes into it. It's just like, well, let's basically annoy the industry. Let's disrupt the market. Let's ban the advertising, and we're moving things around. Under 12 years of Conservative government, we've got legislation telling Asda where they can position their chocolate eggs and their cheese and their bacon. It's preposterous, isn't it? But yeah, it's absolutely part of the same thing. It's a bunch of fanatics who are coalesced around this idea of public health, which actually is just people's private health issues multiplied over the population.
Okay, I think we've got time for 2 more questions, I'm afraid. Lady in the middle here, and then I'll come to the gentleman here. If I have time for the gentleman right at the far, very back, but we've only got a few minutes.
Thank you. Hilary Salt. I agree with everything everybody said, but I still got a bit of a wet liberal worry about kind of big tobacco. And just inspired by Chris's use of the word abolition, I mean, is there an argument that what we should be abolishing is the export of tobacco products? Shouldn't be exporting misery, making money, profit from the third world's addiction?
Do you mean import? Because we don't make any cigarettes in this country at all now. We don't make the products. We don't do anything. I think the last factory closed in Northern Ireland shortly after plain packaging came in. So look, you can hate on big corporations and what have you. I'm not a great fan of big corporations by and large anyway. But the freedom to sell something is indivisible from the freedom to buy it. Some people will say, well, we're going to ban the sale of cigarettes, but that's not prohibition because you'll still be able to grow your own tobacco. I mean, this is like saying, well, prohibition in America in 1920s wasn't prohibition because you could still, get your own apples and put them in a mangle and they turn into cider. It's an excuse not to admit to being a prohibitionist. Obviously, you need to have, unless you are prepared to go through the hassle of growing tobacco in the climate that's not really made for it, which I do know one person who does that, actually. Pat Nurse grows her own tobacco. No, you need to have businesses selling you the thing, regardless of whether you like them or you think they're too profitable. If anything, what you want is more competition in the market. There hasn't been any competition in the tobacco market for a good 30-odd years because there's such high barriers to entry thanks to government regulations such as advertising bans. It just makes these companies richer and richer, actually.
Okay, gentleman here, and then we'll try and get the guy at the back.
Thank you. Callum Davis, a Cardiff councillor. Where Comrade Drakeford has also even mused about banning smoking on high streets even. You mentioned the report earlier about increasing the price of cigarettes by 30%. I think I started smoking around 8 years ago and it has gone up by that much already. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is it politically viable to cut, this is probably sin taxes or even on alcohol and things, but is it politically viable to do that? Surely all the smokers would want to vote for you if you did that. Thank you.
Well, if anyone's going to do it, it'd be Liz Truss, you would think. Has been anti-nanny state all her parliamentary career. But I gather today, with the U-turn, that there are no plans at all to cut any taxes, even things like the sugar tax, unfortunately. So there you go.
Right, and finally the chap at the far back in the white shirt. Did you put your hand up?
Yes.
No, sorry, it's the guy right at the very back. No, sorry, it's my fault.
Hi there, I'm Kit Joubert from the University of Exeter. I'm just wondering, in regard to going to university in the modern day, what I tend to find, especially down on the Penryn campus, is you have nightclubs and bars that allow vaping because it isn't illegal to do it indoors. And what I'm finding is there's a lot of my friends becoming smokers or vapors through the allowance of people being able to share a vape easily inside the club as another high. So my question to the board is, should vaping be banned indoors like smoking?
Absolutely not. You need a big differential between something that's relatively safe against the thing that's going to kill you. And we still have millions of people smoking in the UK. So it needs to be more attractive than smoking. And ultimately, how many smokers do you want to die to slightly restrict a few more people vaping? The numbers don't really suggest that there's a huge rise, more than there was ever with smoking in young people vaping. And nicotine, as we talked about, it's relatively safe, and there's a stigma which is attached to smoking that we need to sort of get over and move on from.
Okay, now Sarah at the back is going to be winding us up in a minute. So Claire she's the parliamentarian, so she has the final word. Then I'm going to thank everybody, and then we're going to go off to the nearest bar. Right, Claire.
In relation to big tobacco, every big corporation does it for profits, not for our health. And big tobacco over the years, from early on, has been responsible for lying to people in the initial period. But since then, actually, I think that it's no different to any other corporation. What I find most galling relates to what Simon said at the beginning, was when I'm actually involved in debates with big tobacco where they're more anti-tobacco than the prohibitionists. I mean, one of the times I was on a panel here, I was being lectured on the dangers of smoking by a Philip Morris executive. I did think it was a bit much. So as far as I'm concerned, tobacco is a legal product. These companies make profit out of selling that product. That's the end of it. I don't like a lot of like everything, like big oil, like all the rest of it. And if they don't like it, they should leave and not lecture us about the dangers of their product. That's one thing. I wanted to finish on Comrade Drakeford in Wales, who I can't stand, but it's really easy to make fun of the Welsh government because Drakeford runs it. And it's very easy at Conservative Party conference to console yourself that the problem is a Labour government in Wales or the SNP government in Scotland bringing in these draconian measures. The truth is, these measures have been brought in by a Conservative government. A Conservative government has been at the forefront of putting forward, as commissioning reports, putting forward the notion of a smoke-free area and so on. And all I'm saying is that easy picking to point the finger somewhere else. I'm actually on the left, and I'm far more pro-freedom than anybody that I've met in the Conservative Party. At the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is on in a couple of weeks, you should all come to, you'll find a lot more people who are pro-freedom than you will at this conference. I think look to your own. Sort it out, right? What has happened to you lot, right? You've lost your bottle, in my opinion.
Yeah, sort it out, sort it out. Right, thank you. I'm sorry we haven't got all the questions in. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Mark Oates, Christopher Snowden, and Claire Fox, and thank you to you.